Good evening, gentlemen. We are still near the beginning of chapter 3 of Tanya, and last time we went all the way up to Mincha, so we were interrupted kind of in the middle of things. We were interrupted in the course of our studies, and we are discussing the concept of the 10 Sefiros. And really what we're doing is we're bringing lots of information that isn't explicitly mentioned in the Tanya before we read what the Tanya has to say, in order that we can feel we have a better grounding in this concept, and the concept of the 10 Sefiros, of the 10 means by which God creates the 10 divine traits. And all of this is really in the process of discussing the structure and nature of the godly soul, where really the point is that since the godly soul is a piece of God above, literally, and since it comes from God, it maintains the structure, so to speak, of godliness. That just as God himself, so to speak, manifests 10 Sefiros or 10 divine traits, 10 divine manifestations, so too the soul, as it comes down to this world, the godly soul, as it is here with us, has this form and this structure. It also has 10 ways in which it is manifest, the structure of the godly soul, because of course the core of the godly soul is the divine I am. God says I am. That is the core, that is the spiritual essence of the godly soul. However, the soul operates as a full and functioning human self, as we know, down here in this world. It has become something like a created self. It's elokus shenaisa nivra, as we said in previous classes in the previous chapter. It is godliness that becomes a creation. So as a creation, it has the same structure as the animal soul. The animal soul, as we're going to read in later chapters, and the godly soul share these 10 traits, at least in their general structure. They share the same traits. We discussed last time some of the more Kabbalistic aspects of the 10 Sefiros, and we used this picture in our class, which we got from the Aryeh Kaplan's translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, in order to describe the idea of the 3 mothers and the 7 pairs, right? The 7 doubles, right? We explained which letters in the Hebrew alphabet these all correspond to, because as we explained, God creates through Sefiros and God creates through letters. And really, in a sense, in the Kabbalah, these things are interchangeable. These are really the same thing, the letters and the pairs. Someone check for me and see if the class is online right now. There's a little thing on the screen. Facebook or YouTube would be good? It is. Okay, good. All right. Okay. Let's continue our discussion of what these 10 Sefiros are from where we left off last time. And, I should preface, I was thinking about this, that I've known this list of 10 and studied this list of 10 Sefiros for many years. And it's quite difficult. It's quite a complicated subject. And the fact is that I myself still find the 10 Sefiros and their interactions and their function, even in the soul, to be quite confusing. So I'm still going to press forward and try and give you my best understanding or general understanding of what these 10 functions are. So where we were last time is we were discussing that the 10 Sefiros, and in this picture we have Keser instead of Das, right? Depending which one you want to call a Sefira. We were explaining how the 10 Sefiros can be divided generally into 3 groups of 3, although the last group of 3 actually has 4, because there's 10 Sefiros, not 9, right? The understanding of the Sefiros, and to actually be able to begin to appreciate them in some kind of rational way. What I mean by appreciating the Sefiros in a rational way, because we prefaced last time that the divine Sefiros are not really something that are necessarily within the realm of human comprehension. But even the 10 faculties of the soul are very difficult to understand. Even the faculties that we'll have in our own experience are difficult to really appreciate and understand. It helps a lot to understand the 10 Sefiros if you appreciate that the soul, as we've been describing it, exists both in an inner and an outer world. We've already discussed the inner and the outer world in various contexts. In the first chapter we discussed it, then we discussed it again, talking about the nature of the godly soul, the structure of the godly soul. All of Tanya is about Pnimius. All of Tanya is about the revolution of the Alter Rebbe is that everything the Baal Shem Tov describes, everything that exists in Chassidus can be understood in an inner way. The focus is, obviously the Baal Shem Tov also taught Pnimius HaTorah, the inner Torah, but the Alter Rebbe took the inner Torah to its most inner. The whole focus is on the concept and the way of inner, the inner reality. And so in Tanya, when we learn, for example, about, as we said in the first chapter, when we said, what's a tzaddik, we say it has nothing to do with their actions and behavior, right? We said it can't be that. It must be something more inner, for example, right? When we said, what's the soul, we said that the soul, we don't suffice with how the soul behaves or what the soul does. We went to the innermost truth, which is the spiritual I am, that's at the heart of the animal soul, and the divine I am, which is at the heart of the godly soul. God saying I am is the essence of the godly soul. However, so both of those descriptions of these two souls are totally, what's the word? These are isolated definitions of what the soul is, right? In other words, or totally inner, totally inside definitions of what the souls are. For example, if I tell you that the animal soul is just a sense of I am, that tells you nothing about it, right? It doesn't tell you how it interacts. It doesn't tell you what it does. It doesn't even tell you, if you had never met a person, and I told you that what a person is at the deepest level is a sense of I am, that would tell you nothing about people at all. You wouldn't have anything to go on. You wouldn't know what a person was, really, in any sense. So too with the divine I am. If I told you the godly soul, what a Jew is, the divine soul of a Jew, is God saying I am, that tells you nothing about the godly soul at all. It tells you nothing and everything at the same time, right? In other words, it tells you the definition of a thing, but this is not a contextual definition. The only context of this definition is the relationship with God, right? One is God saying I am, the other one is not God saying I am. That's really the two.
That's all it is.
Right? Right, that's all it is. But on the other hand, that's not all it is, because the soul, both of these souls are every fully functioning and complex human being that you encounter, right, in some sense is this soul. So, the soul is not just what it is unto itself, right? The soul also exists within an external context, right? It exists in its own inner world, right? In other words, the soul has a subjective experience of itself. It has a subjective being. It has what's called in philosophy and psychology interiority, right? It has an inside. It's not just something that's known from an outside, right? A stone or this chair doesn't have, in the same way anyway, does not have interiority. It's all outside. There's no inside to it, right? All it is material. What you see is what it is, right? If you say, oh, but it has an inside because there's what's underneath the top layer of upholstery, right? That's not an inside. That's just a deeper layer of outside, right? It has no inside in the sense that a person has an inside, right? Where a person has their own inner world and their own inner self-relation, their own inner being that no one else knows, right? However, the soul is not just its own inner world or inner being, because before you can even have an inner world, there has to be some kind of being first. The soul also extends outward. And when we look at other people, we see their soul from the outside. We see like what we are, right? But we're approaching it from the opposite direction to such an extent that you could even doubt whether someone else has the same insight that you do, because you only know them from the outside. Right? That's why there's been all sorts of philosophers that have speculated that theoretically everyone else in the world could have no inner life at all, and you would never know, right? Because maybe they just behave, maybe they're just robots programmed to behave like people, right? With no real interiority, with no real inner life or inner, and there'd be no way of knowing because the inner world, the inner life, is totally subjective, right? Why am I bringing this up in the context of the Sefiros? Because the 10 faculties of the soul are much better differentiated, as I hope to show in today's class, right? To really understand what something is, you have to be able to differentiate it, right? If you don't know, if I showed you a picture of a frog and a toad, or an alligator and a crocodile, right? A person who knows what an alligator is can distinguish it from a crocodile, right? Someone who doesn't really know and has a general gesture, so it's all the same, it's kind of a mishmash, right? So the same thing with the Sefiros, and when I say that understanding the 10 faculties is difficult, that's really what I mean. It's not difficult to give a very general sort of gesture to what the 10 faculties of the soul are. It's very common, in fact. It's one of the first things most people learn when they learn Chassidus, probably because they run into it right here in the 3rd chapter of Tanya. But to understand what they are in a way that they can actually be finely distinguished one from another is a much more subtle thing, is a much more edel thing, and requires a lot more thinking, because usually most answers to what any of them are, you could always ask the counter position of what's the difference, right? If you tell me, if I ask you what Chachma is, and you tell me a classic Hasidic answer that we'll read in Tanya, which says that Chachma is bittul, right? Chachma is the point of the soul's nullification, whatever that means, right? So I would say, but isn't in its own way Gvura bittul, because Gvura is Yira, and isn't in its own way Heid bittul, because Heid is acknowledgement, right, subjugation, and isn't Malchus bittul, because Malchus is the lowest of the 10 spheres and the point of Kabbalah soul, right? So in other words, you understand what it is, but also you don't understand what it is. You know what an alligator is in order not to get eaten by one, maybe, right? You know, but you don't know what it is. The different from a crocodile, if you understand this strange metaphor. So it's much easier to be able to make these fine distinctions when you realize that the spheres are process, right? The spheres are, you have a soul that is beyond structure. In other words, you have an inner point that's absolutely simple. That's what we discussed in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Each one has its own inner point. The animal soul's inner point is I am, Klippa and Sitra Achra. The inner point of the godly soul is Kedusha, Getlichkeit, godliness. It's God saying I am, right? But the soul does not exist in simplicity. That simplicity is expressed and embodied, so to speak, in a structure and a process. And that process is the process of the pure interior simplicity of the soul, and it's in its inner reality coming outward, out into, and being able to relate to the world. So this structure of the 10 spheres, when we're talking about the soul anyway, setting aside this, when we say the spheres in this class, we're going to be talking mostly about the faculties of the soul, setting aside the divine 10 spheres, which we already spoke about last time or the time before, about how the two things are not so closely connected anyway. They're very abstractly related, but not directly, right? So I'm talking about in the soul, in the godly soul itself, the human version, so to speak, of these things. So the 10 spheros are a process that you could divide into two general categories, okay? I know I said 3 groups of 3, but before we even get to the 3 groups of 3, okay? There's 2 general divisions. The first division is between Seichel and Midos, is 3 and 7. That's the most general division, and actually how the Alter Rebbe is going to divide them when we read it here, as we already read, and we're going to continue to read. There's 3 verses 7, which is generally called Seichel and Midos, which means intellect and emotion, right? Let us posit, for the purposes of our class, I don't know to be honest, I don't know whether this is 100% correct always in every sense. It's probably not. But let's say, for the purposes of our class, to simplify it for our purposes, right? The intellect is how the soul relates to things that are more inner than it is. Or to put it in a different way, the soul is for inner relation. The intellect is for inner relation. The intellect is pointed inside, not outside. The intellect, the soul, we're describing the soul as a whole structure. Part of the structure relates inner, part of the structure relates outer, right? The intellect primarily is focused inner. It's an inner focused faculty made up of three parts, but the intellect in general.
Inner into yourself, or
yes,
or into the inner of the other.
No, both. But
both.
Inner, okay. but inner into yourself is this primary sense in which I mean it. What I mean is that the main function of the intellect is to make the person into an external aspect of something else. That's really the focus of the intellect. In other words, let's put it simply, right? When you fully understand a concept in engineering or mathematics or anything really, history, it doesn't matter. When you fully understand that concept, right? When you fully understand it in all of its parts, you understand it with chachma, which means you have an intuitive grasp of it, in which you saw the whole thing in its perfection, which is a way that can't be put into words or really analyzed. Then the chachma comes down into bina, in which the thing itself is lost, but its impression remains, and therefore on the impression you're able to do analysis and take it apart and put it back together again. And then you bring it into das, which means that this is not just something that remains above you, but something that exists as much as you do. It's brought into the reality of your soul, right? When a person does all of these three things, and that's seichel, what they have effectively done is they have a definition of themselves in terms of something else, right? In other words, I fully understand the Pythagorean theorem, let's say. So now my mind is an extension, to an extent, of the Pythagorean theorem. In an obvious way when I'm actively thinking about it, because then really all there is the Pythagorean theorem, and my mind has just become literally an extension of it, or an instantiation, an embodiment of it. Right? But even when I'm not thinking about it, through das, through fully understanding it and bringing it into my reality, right? My reality has become a reality that is an extension of its reality. You understand what I'm saying?
You can bring it up whenever you want.
We exist relative to each other. It's become something that is now as real to me as myself, right? It has been brought into our universe. So in other words, a person uses their intellect to change themselves. Really what is changing is my self-awareness and my self-location, my self-reality, my sense of my own inner reality, right? My inner world is what's changed. My inner world is now an inner world that intersects with the Pythagorean theorem. We now share worlds. Our worlds are linked at least, right? Or maybe even the same world, depending how you look at it or how the extent of the thought that's taken place, right? Seichel is for inner relation. It's what I use to reconfigure and change my inner world. It's the structure of my inner reality in that sense, yes? Emotions, midos, which are the other seven faculties or spheres, are the opposite. Instead of being internally focused, they are externally focused, which means that now that me and the thing exist within a shared inner conception, I now view myself as another being in one world with it, right? In other words, let's switch away from the Pythagorean. Well, you could use the Pythagorean theorem with a very passionate mathematician. You could use, right? So let's say you have someone who's very passionate about math, right? They learned so much about the Pythagorean theorem that they're planning a trip to Greece now, right? To go and see where all the ancient Greek mathematicians lived, where Pythagoras lived, right? I think he may have lived in modern day Turkey, but we'll set that aside. Anyway, yeah, Mykonos. So first you have this deep intersection of the worlds intellectually. When you bring it into emotions, starting with chesed and then moving on to gvura, etc., all the 7 emotional qualities, instead of self-transformation and transformation of one's own awareness and inner world, one is now treating the thing as an external being, right? I love mathematics, so there's a mathematics and there's a me, right? And me and mathematics, in order for there to be both of us, that means we both exist inside of some third thing, which the third thing is what connects both of us, right? Call it a universe, external world, right? So emotionally, I can now go and attach myself to it. What's the difference between these 2 steps? The difference between these 2 steps is that when I think about it intellectually, I never move when we think about it purely intellectually. I only change, but I don't move. What's the difference? The difference is that when you think about something with pure intellect, it's cold, right? It's cold, as opposed to the emotions which are warm. What do we mean by cold and warm? The intellect receives and brings those worlds together and becomes aware of and knows other things other than itself in a way where it itself is invisible, right? The whole use of the intellect is meant to be an effort in setting myself aside, right? It's not treating myself as a being that can move, as a being that can go somewhere, as a being that can do things. I am not the subject here, right? The thing I'm studying or the thing I'm learning is the subject. And so I, as a collective being, myself, am not in the picture. I'm not attached to the Pythagorean theorem or detached from it, right? It's not about me. I'm trying to understand this thing. So in intellect, the self is forgotten, which is the power of the intellect. The whole power and the whole quality and the whole advantage of the intellect is that it's not about the self at all, right? Now, the truth is that, of course, the self is still involved, right? Because all of this is based in the self. The question is only, is the self the overt subject? Is it what's actually under discussion, what's actually being experienced? Or does it become more in the background, more implicit, right? This is how you understand fine gradations, like the gradation between Chachma and Bina, where sometimes we say the difference between Chachma and Bina, the 2 intellectual qualities of wisdom and understanding, are so different one from the other that you could say one is the ayin and one is the yesh. One is the nothing and one is the something, right? In a broader sense, both of them are intellectual, which means both of them are really in nothing, in the sense of both of them are less egotistical than the emotions, because the emotions are moving the self within an external world. It's all about where do I find myself? How am I oriented? What am I doing? That's all questions of the emotions. The intellect, right, is theoretically very selfless compared to that. But within the intellect, you can't compare the relationship of Chachma to the idea to the relationship of Bina. Because Chachma, wisdom, the first Sefira, right, really is just an acceptance of each of the idea exactly as it is, which means that I myself am really not involved in any way. Whereas in Bina, even though when I'm analyzing something to really understand it, which is most of what we call intellect in regular mundane conversation, when I'm analyzing something to understand it, right, taking it apart, putting it back together again, testing the logical relationship between things, etc., etc. So when I'm doing that, I am much more involved. It's much more, what do I think about the thing? rather than accepting the thing in its whole and perfect self exactly as it is. So you could say Bina is Yesh and Chachma is Ayin, but relatively speaking, both are intellect. Both of them are not about me, they're both about the thing, right? I'm just demonstrating for you the general difference between Chachma, between Seichel and Midah, between intellect and emotions.
But once it goes into Das,
Yeah.
which is literally the keser of the midot, it automatically gets a connection to the midot.
Well, that's why Das is in a sense is the connector, right? And of course, Seichel is Melid Midas. The intellect and the emotions are connected, but nevertheless, despite being connected, they are in a way opposites at the same time. There's part of the richness of the whole model is that in a way, and that's why Das is such an interesting idea, because Das is in both camps, right? Das is somehow both, right? Das, because we've been saying that Das is this idea of awareness, right? Of being in the same universe as the thing, right? So on the one hand, to be in the same universe as the thing says nothing about me or what I have to do. Das is just awareness. But on the other hand, all awareness, right, creates the grounds for relating to it as an external reality, because now it's in my universe. Now it exists the way I exist, right? So in a way, it's both. In a way, it is and it isn't, right? But you're right that, of course, the whole idea is that the intellect gives birth to the emotions, a very important idea in Chabad, as we'll see. This is part of the Alter Rebbe's whole plan, very important to understand, as we're going to read in Tanya. One of the main things we have to say about the intellect is that it gives birth to the emotions, but nevertheless, they're different one from the other. The intellect is not the emotions. One causes the other, but they are not the same. That's the most general breakdown. Seichel versus Midas, 3 verses 7. Then, more specifically, you have these three triads. The three breakdowns, the third of which actually has 4 members, right? So 3, 3, and 4. The breakdown of the Sefiros. So we already just went through Chachma, Bina, and Das in a very brief way, right? Chachma is the way that the mind, you could even say maybe Chachma and Bina is the mind opening around something and then closing around it, right? The mind opens in Chachma and then it closes in Bina. I mean that if you have an idea like the Pythagorean theorem, right? This is a very physical metaphor, but you have an idea like the Pythagorean theorem. Chachma is I've opened to accept it, so now it's here, and Bina is right biting in. Bina is where my being and its being are joined, right? I'm now going to get my hands dirty and analyze it, etc. Das, right? And of course, Chachma is on the right side. We talked about the right, left, and middle last time. Chachma is on the right side of the spheres. Bina is on the left. And then you have Das, which unites the two of them. Das is very special. There's a lot of things to say about Das, maybe a different time. But the bottom line is Das is awareness. Das is connection, right? And in another one of these questions, I could ask you to make the fine distinction that Das is connection, but Yesod is also connection. So what's the difference between Das and Yesod? Something we'll discuss briefly, right? But Das in general is connection. Sefiros is also connection, by the way. And so is Malchus. Everything in the middle is connection. The whole middle row is a form of connection. But Das is what's most commonly called in Chassidus connection, is Kashrus, connection. And Das, the reason why Das is connection is because Das actually goes between all of the spheres with each other. Das is like the glue which holds all of the spheres in one thing, which if you think about it, is very similar to the concept of awareness, right? The whole idea of being aware of multiple complex facets of oneself and one's personality, right? They're all held as one thing and held and beheld as one thing. In awareness, right? In my awareness, and I'm aware of myself as one whole thing. That awareness is what binds and holds it together, right? Holds it together as one thing. And we've already spoken about awareness of awareness of other things, right? Which, okay. So, we'll mention this very briefly. I don't know if this is the place to really get into it, but you understand, of course, that since seichel and the intellect is, as I've been putting it, is the ability to transform oneself in the sense of bringing oneself into contact with other realities from the inside, so to speak, right, without moving further away from them or anything like that as external realities. So we understand that this is the description of seichel. So then we understand immediately that this works very differently in the animal soul and the godly soul, right? The animal soul, as it says many times in Chassidus, is primarily midas, is primarily emotional, not intellectual. As we're going to read in Tanya, the godly soul is primarily intellectual. All of this is complicated because the animal soul has a very rich and powerful intellect, and if it didn't have it, it wouldn't be the whole process of Chassidus and the service of God in Chassidus would not work if the animal soul did not have a very powerful and functioning intellect. Obviously, most of the intellect we use all of the time is the animal soul's intellect. So obviously, it's very highly functioning intellect. However, nevertheless, there's still a distinction. The godly soul is much more associated with intellect than the animal soul is, for the simple reason that the godly soul is able to appreciate intellect and even the source of intellect for its own sake, whereas the animal soul, since the animal soul's every chachma, since the animal soul's every state of bittul is still grounded in the I am of klipa, right? Its bittul is always limited. Whereas the godly soul, if we define intellect and the highest ability of intellect as the ability to transform oneself in the face of the truth, right? Then that's what the godly soul is all about. The godly soul, by nature, desires to draw closer to the truth. It's all about this idea of self-transformation with no need for an external, no inherent need, we should say, for an external reality, which makes it very interesting that the person who's coming to study the Tanya, his question to the Alter Rebbe was, how can I serve God with love and fear all together as one, right, with my mind and all of these things, which means that the godly soul, the whole thing is to try and bring forth love and fear, apparently with the godly soul, even though the godly soul is really a being of intellect. It's something to think about.
Say it again. Sorry.
The godly soul's emotions are obviously important because we want to serve God with love and fear, and that's a major goal of the Tanya. But the Tanya will also explain to us, and we'll try and work all of this out as we go, that the godly soul is primarily intellectual. The godly soul is not primarily emotional, which is a different way of saying the godly soul's whole life is oriented towards the inside, towards its own source, right? The godly soul wants to become nothing, wants to be nothing and be purely an expression of something else. Whereas the animal soul, what does it use even its chachma for? To make other things into an expression of itself, right? The opposite direction. This is the difference between intellect and emotions. Intellect is to make yourself an expression of something else, ultimately. That's the ultimate goal. Emotions is, and even to ultimately cease to exist entirely, if you take that further. The emotions, the entire idea is to make something else into an expression of me, is ultimately the goal, ultimately the functions of the emotions, as we are about to discuss. The emotions begin with chesed, gvura, and tiferes. Those are the first three, and the primary emotions. The Alter Rebbe is not even going to mention the other four, I don't believe, in this chapter of Tanya. He's going to say, but because the other four really derive from these three. These three are the primary ones. And really, as you'll see, since the Alter Rebbe has such a focus on pnimius and the inner reality, the last four are the least pnimius, the least inner of these, and therefore, since they are so externally orientated, right, in the Alter Rebbe's view, perhaps we could even say, this may be going too far, but perhaps we could even say that in the Alter Rebbe's view, these last four really only serve to actualize everything else that's in the inner world, because it's all external. That's all technicalities, you might even say, right? I don't know if it would be too far to ascribe that to the Alter Rebbe, but in a sense, right, since we're talking about, we're going to get to external things, like what we call the levushim, like thought, speech, and action. We're going to get to that soon in Tanya, but in the chapter that's about internal things, right, we speak about the things that are really internal, which is the first 6 Sefiros, right, whereas the last 4 really are, in a way, pre-levushim, they're pre-external Sefiros, rather than internal Sefiros themselves. I'll explain what I mean in a second. So you have Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes. These are the primary emotional spheres, right? Spoken about in Chassidus a lot, right? Chesed, Gvura, and Tiferes are dispositional. Good word in English, right? They're a person's disposition, right? Which some people translate it, some people would say personality. I think disposition is a more precise word than personality. Personality is a very ill-defined character. I like disposition because disposition implies that there's something else, and this is how I'm disposed to it, right? This is how I'm set up to deal with it, so to speak, right? It's disposition.
Character be the same.
Yeah, I'm not arguing. The emotions are external. In other words, as far as I'm concerned, let's put it a different way. As far as I'm concerned, in my in my normal human state, nothing other than me exists, as far as I'm concerned, right? If you're talking about the animal soul, right? Setting aside the godly soul for a moment, which just complicates things. Although still, it's not necessarily untrue about the godly soul. You just have to use better words to not get lost in the wrong connotations, right? But as far as I'm concerned, nothing other than me exists. Everything that I experience in my internal world, right? In other words, my experience, even of the chair I'm sitting on right now, is an experience you're not having. As far as I know, you don't even exist, right? Because my experience of you as someone that can have experiences is something only I'm having, right? Everything is, in a way, all of nature comes through the supernatural. All experiences are through the soul's subjectivity. Everything I'm experiencing right now is basically more or less only in the subjective reality. Now, of course, this is an exaggeration because some things are much more objective, right? If this table, we both put our cups on this table, right? I put my coffee and you put your coffee down on this same table, right? There's a reason for that, assuming that you exist and everything, right? So the intellect changes a person. The intellect is essentially my willingness to posit that other things do exist, right? It's my willingness to do that. In the godly soul, that's the godly soul's main desire, right? On the contrary, the godly soul only wants other things to exist, right? As we're going to learn, I think in chapter 18 of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is very... the words are radical or take you aback. All the godly soul wants is to not exist. That's its deepest desire. All it wants is to not exist. Because the godly soul's spiritual essence is God saying, I am. So all it wants is to not exist within godliness. That's all it wants. The animal soul is the opposite. The animal soul, its deepest desire is that only it should exist, which is why seichel is something like an acquired language for the animal soul. That's why, someone once said, there was once I forget who said it, but someone said, the whole earth is constantly being invaded by barbarians, right? We call them children. It's only through education that we can transform this constantly invading barbarian horde into civilized people. And it's a much longer speech. He says the barbarians are everywhere. They're in every country, in every city, right? They're totally uncivilized. They have no inner mind. They have no higher intellectual goals, right? It's only through education and civilization, right? That's the reason why that is because the animal soul, although it has an intellect, right? That intellect has to be fostered. It doesn't come naturally to it like breathing. Whereas if the whole world was just godly souls, right, this would not be an issue. The godly soul is inherently civilized because it inherently does not want to exist. That's its deepest desire, right? So I'm getting way off track here. It's a battle. You like it. I have to teach Tanya. It's complicated. The emotions. Once you have the intellect in place, which is willing to accept that other things exist and are as real as I am, which is what Das is, the emotions are for dealing with other things in that context, right? Really, if you think about it, the intellect totally transforms the self, right? Because the self goes from something that needs no justification and no relation. The self exists within itself. I don't need to justify myself to anyone. I don't need to explain myself to anyone. I don't need to deal with anyone. I exist totally and completely unto myself and within myself, right? The intellect ruins all of this. The intellect, as some would say it was much better when people were barbarians and had no intellect, right? If such a thing ever existed. Human sacrifice and genocidal wars to the contrary. But the mind, the life of the mind transforms the person, because now all of a sudden there's all of these other things that really exist, that I take to exist like I do. So the emotions, right, fully functional human emotions, right, the ones Chassidus say derive from the intellect, not the natural emotions of a small child, which are not the same as the emotions that derive from the intellect. It's a different type of emotion. It's much more connected to ratzon and will than what we normally call the emotions. What are really called the emotions in a healthy human adult, right, where the emotions are based on the awareness and world of things that I consider real to myself, which is determined by the intellect. So these emotions now determine, they are how I am grounded and oriented within this external world that I've created within myself. If you follow what I'm saying. I've created an external world within myself. I have an external world, right? Before I had an intellect and before other things were real to me, I had no external world within myself, right? I'm the only thing that really exists. Yes, I understand there's sensations and things to manipulate, and I'll get food if I go to this place, and I'll get water if I go to this place. But there's nothing is as real in this as I am. This is all just myself unto myself doing my own thing. Now that I really have an intellect, there are other things. There's a world of things that exist to me, right? So that means that I now have a self-conception and a self that exists within this reality of all things that are real, right? The way that self is oriented toward things in that world is midas, is chesed, gvura, and tiferes. Those are my three functions that I use in orienting myself towards these now real realities. Chesed and gvura are opposites. Chesed normally translated as kindness, gvura as discipline or loving kindness, gvura as discipline, severity, judgment. Chesed is the idea, generally speaking, that I should be open and moving towards these things that are now real to me in my in my inner external world, right? I love pizza. It's not really a good example, really, because it's a true example, but most of our love of pizza is sub-rational, right? It's not really the middays. It's just a bodily desire. It's just a grumbling of the stomach. There's a story that comes to mind that we heard in yeshiva about termites that can't be really said in the context of this class. We'll have to say it at a Fabrengen or something with more l'chaim. If we had vodka instead of coffee at these classes, then I could tell you the story about the termites.
Shall I go to the kitchen?
No. It's too late for this one. Next time, God willing. There's a difference between a real emotion and a desire or need of the body. Suffice it to say, as we'll discuss, they're connected and related and sort of the same, but also different. So the real chesed, born of the intellect, is the desire to move closer towards, right, these other things, which means to I want to see us together in a more, in a richer and more defined and more solid context, right? In other words, the whole idea of chesed and moving toward Avraham Avinu is the example of chesed, right? Avraham Avinu's chesed expressed as his kindness. He was willing to give to anyone. His whole life was open. Right? Chesed in general, openness. Gvura, closeness. Right? Chesed is the idea that I'm open to anyone who's wandering the road. That's really what chesed is. Chesed is, if you're like Avraham Avinu and you're fundamentally an Isha Chesed, that means all the things that my mind knows exist and are real realities, right? I'm open to all of them and I give of myself to all of them. I want to see us united in some kind of context. I'm trying to, my mind tells me we both exist, but now that there's this shared existence between us, I want to strengthen, I want to ground that context. I want to bring that context and make it more real, right? I want that you should be the person who came to Avram's tent, and I want me to be the person that had the tent and brought you in, right? I want to strengthen that connection. Gvura, right? And chesed is the source, as we're going to read, of love of God, right? In the godly soul. Gvura is fear of God. I'm going to translate it in the literal translation. Some say awe and respect are better translations, and there's good arguments for that. I'm going to call it fear for now, and we'll deal with the fine gradations later, what we mean by fear. If we get far enough, way later in Tanya, there's very rich and detailed descriptions of different levels of fear of God and things like that. But the Gvura, which was Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak our father, is the opposite tendency. Gvura is moving further away, right? I don't want us to be united in this context. How could you say that fear of God is moving further away from God, right? So in a sense, this is where things become subtle and more complicated, right? You have to understand that moving away in the sense of Gvura is not really moving away in the sense of there's now actually literally distance between us. It's more, I'm going to recede and let you fill the place. Right? In other words, we're still close, but we're close in a different way. Instead of closeness through my openness, right? We're closeness through the recognition of the fundamental difference between us, right? Instead of chesed, which wants to create a context in which we're connected, where I'm welcoming you into my tent and you're being welcomed into my tent. And so it's like we're all together, we're all bound up in this story, in this context, right? Gevura is the opposite. Gevura is, I recognize the preciousness of what you are and the preciousness of what I am, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm not going to make an effort that the two of us, we should try and connect the two of us through some external means, right? In other words, it's closeness, but the only way we're going to be close is if it fits by itself, right? We're going to be close because where you are is exactly where I'm not because there's a context which unites us. right? You understand the difference? So chesed, neither one of them is distance, God forbid. It can be expressed as distance. The truth is that chesed can also be expressed as distance, right? What about giving money to a tzedakah so that it will go away? You don't have to think about it and don't feel guilt anymore, right? Chesed at a distance, distancing chesed, right? So it's not so pasha. This is part of why I'm trying to give this whole class about this, because you have to realize that the subtleties here are profound. And this is before you even get into hiskalalus and the way that each one of them is made up of all the other ones, right? So this is at the most basic level. You have to realize that they're complicated. Gevura is not about distance, it's about preciousness, right? I recognize how precious what I have is, and I wouldn't want to dilute it by making it you. Right, Gevura is like what the Kotzker Rebbe said, the famous saying of the Kotzker Rebbe, that if I'm I because you're you, and you're you because I am I, then I'm not I and you're not you. But if I'm I because I am I and you're you because you're you, then I'm really I and you're really you. Right?
We can talk.
What? And then we can talk. In other words, that's Gevura. Gevura is, I'm not going to define myself, right? Even though the Kotzker Rebbe's whole emphasis was on emes, which is really Tiferes. Maybe that's a different diuk for a different time. But as Yaakov was emes, right? Yaakov is Tiferes. But our father, Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, our father. But the Gevura is the whole idea that you're you and I'm I, but we can still be together. In fact, as I think from this explanation you'll see, that's why in Chassidus we would much rather have sweetened Gevura, Hamtakas Hadinim, than Chesed. Chesed, there's a certain coldness. There's actually a certain distance inherent to Chesed. That's why Chesed is water, Gevura is fire, right? There's a certain distance inherent to Chesed, because Chesed says we can come together if there's some third thing which we can kind of both, we can make make compromises, so to speak, and there can be some kind of context or third thing in which we're both found together. Whereas Gevura can, in the harsh form, Gevura manifests as there's no connection between us. Right? You're not deserving of what I have, is really what is the harsh form of Gevura, right? But the sweetened form of Gevura is that you have what I have, but without me having to make any compromises. It's actually the true togetherness. The true togetherness is sweetened Gevura, because you remain exactly where you are. You don't have to move at all. I remain exactly where I am, and yet somehow we're still together. You're still next to me. You're in the space where I'm not, right? That's the sweetened Gevura, and that's actually much better in the eyes of Chassidus, in the eyes of Pnimius Torah. Sweetened Gevura is really what you want. It's a much deeper connection than Chesed. Then, of course, you have Tiferes. Tiferes is, can you say about Tiferes? We just had the birthday of the Rebbe Maharash, the famous story. You read it in the Yom Yom, right? Where the Rebbe Maharash is Shmuel of Lubavitch, fourth Rebbe of Lubavitch. His Melamed went to his father and was so impressed with what he studied that he said, "Aren't you amazed with your son's learning?" And his father, the Tzemach Tzedek, says, "What's the surprise that Tiferes Shebetiferes did well, right? Anyone who's born on the day of the Omer, which is Tiferes of Tiferes, right, is obviously going to be a special neshama, right? Tiferes is the blending of Chesed and Gevura, and hopefully from this whole discussion so far, you realize that this blending is, as Rabbi Elkan would say, nit mit Scotch tape. Not with Scotch tape. That's not how they're blended. You don't just attach Chesed and Gevura together and call it Tiferes. Tiferes is a totally different thing. It's a combination of Chesed and Gevura, but a combination that creates a total third thing. The third thing is described as beauty. It's described as truth, which is very. Who said it? Who said truth is beauty and beauty truth? One of the poets. Keats, Yeats, someone said truth is beauty and beauty truth, and they could have been giving a Kabbalah shir on Tiferes, right? Because in Kabbalah, truth and beauty are the same. They're both in the trait of Tiferes. It's the trait of Torah, the trait of Yaakov Avinu, the trait of Jacob, our forefather. And in personal relationships, in terms of relating to things that are now real to me within my inner external world, right? It's mercy. It's described as rachamim, right? Rachamim is a subtle thing. Just like chesed is more subtle than we thought, and gvura is more subtle, so too rachamim is more subtle. But the general principle of mercy is that mercy is actually, there's a reason it's in the middle row under das, because tiferes, mercy actually is connection to the other person. In other words, chesed is, I need to forge this relationship and come close to this other thing that's real, right? Gvura is, no, we're going to be close, but not through creating a context. We're going to be close just because we're close. We're going to be close by being more what we are, not by being less what we are. We're by being close, not by being open. Tiferes is that. Tiferes is the beautiful and incredible idea that I don't care how the other person comes. The other person is the thing that matters most. That's really the idea of Tiferes. Tiferes, beauty, mercy, is the idea, when we say God's mercy, it's the idea that, yes, there is a way we should have come to God. There was a chesed way we should have come with Avos Hashem. There was a gvura way we should have come with Yiras Hashem, right? Tiferes is the idea that it's more important for us to be together than the way that we should come. Right, which is why Tiferes is in the middle row and fundamentally the principle of connection. And that's what mercy is as well. Mercy is the idea that it doesn't really matter if the other person deserves it or doesn't deserve it. In fact, they probably don't deserve it, right? There probably is no grounds for us to become closer, like I would need in Chesed Gvura, right? But nevertheless, let's still be together, right? Because I choose you over any necessary over the mode of relation. I choose the other person instead of the mode of relating to them. Yeah, it's Tiferes. Wow, this took way longer than I thought it was going to take. We might have to split this into a fourth class. You have Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. You're saying it wouldn't be so terrible. You have Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, right? And Malchus. These are the last three, right? If the three main emotional qualities are about how I'm disposed, my disposition towards the other things that are real, these four qualities are the capacity, the inherent capacity of the soul to be able to go out and actually interact with these things, right? Chesed, Gvur, and Tiferes are all dispositional. They're not actually something that I do, right? They're how I'm oriented. They're not something that I do, right? Avraham would be no less an Isha Chesed if no one else existed. He would still be an Isha Chesed, right? And in fact, that's why Avraham was suffering when there were no guests and Hashem sends the angels. Why was Avraham suffering? Because he was a person of Chesed, even when there was no one to do Chesed to. And that's why he was suffering, because there was no way to manifest his Chesed, right? There was no way to let it out. There was no way to embody it, right? So the previous three are all dispositional. These four are the preparation, are the root in the soul. And as I was saying earlier, this may be why the Alter Rebbe does not discuss them in this chapter, because these four are really the soul, the root in the soul, and the ability of the soul to actually go into that external world and deal with external realities, right? So you have Netzach and Hod, which are two opposites, just like Chesed and Gvura. Netzach usually translated as victory. Hod usually translated as submission. I think acknowledgement, because that's how we translate Hodah. Acknowledgement is a good translation of Hod, right? Netzach and Hod, you could translate even maybe as assertiveness versus acceptance, maybe would be one way of a more modern way maybe of translating assertiveness versus acceptance. Netzach fundamentally is the willingness to overcome. It's victory, right? It's the willingness to overcome any obstacle on the path to what you need to do. Whereas Hod is the subjugation, is acceptance, right? Rather than overcoming obstacles, right? Accepting the reality as it is. And you can immediately see how these are basically the two components of action, because all action is action and inaction, right? All action, all external expression, right, is a combination of what you do and what you don't do. Is a combination of the places where I have to be strong and unyielding, which is netzach, versus the places where I'm willing to give way, right? And all that's how I form my coastline, right? That's how I form, when it comes to Torah principles, right? I have to have lots of netzach, right? Whereas when it comes to Hod, and this is in the most general sense, of course, when it comes to Hod, I have to maybe some worldly thing that for some reason matters to me. I should have more Hod and be more accepting and be not so stand on principle, right? I have to give more leeway because I have to let it go, so to speak. The holding on and letting go. Netzach and Hod, right? Netzach is I hold on to the very end, and both of them. The truth is that that's very simplistic. Again, like Chesed and Gvura, it's more complicated because Netzach and Hod both express in both ways, right? In other words, there could be a very stubborn Hod and there can be a very accepting and passive netzach, right? Netzach sometimes means being passive, but it's still a form of netzach, right? So don't get too caught up in these simple explanations. Malchus, which is the final sphera, is external. Is pardon? Yes. Oh, pardon me. Yesod. Pardon me. Yesod. Thank you very much. Yesod is connection. Yesod is the source of actual connection to other things. In other words, Yesod is really the termination of the upper 9 spheres. It's the termination of this entire process. It's basically the interface with the external. Right? Which is why Yesod is also connection. It's also in the middle, right? So Yesod is the channel whereby all of this, the orientation and then the ability to act, right, to either act or not act, all comes down through. It all comes down through Yesod. And then Malchus, which is the final sphera, is actually almost like the already performed action. Malchus is a special sphera because Malchus is the external. It's where the self gives way to the actual other, right? The actual action that's done externally. Malchus is thought, speech, and action. Malchus is the place where it all comes and is expressed actually outward to the actual other. So in a way, which is why Malchus is also in the middle, Malchus is actually the deepest connection because it's the most actual connection. Right? Everything else is orientation, preparing the roots in the soul's ability to act, the soul's ability to grow closer, right? But when Avram Avinu is an Isha Chesed, but when he actually runs to prepare the food, his feet running is coming through Malchus, the actuality of the thing. Right? The actually expressing externally is Malchus. Malchus is paradoxical because Malchus has all the qualities, because all the things are expressed in actuality through Malchus, but Malchus on its own is nothing. Malchus on its own is totally external, which is why, as we see in the story of the Tanakh, a king can either be, Malchus, majesty, can either be the greatest possible and holiest possible thing, or the lowest and worst possible thing in the whole world, because if Malchus, if external action is a result of and comes through all of this real relationship with the truth, then it's, on the contrary, it has the highest qualities of all things, because you're not just having these things in potential, you're actually changing the world to be in accordance with all of this truth. But if Malchus is left, first of all, just by itself, or even worse, if it's an expression of all terrible things, right, then actually acting on it makes it much worse. It's much worse to actually do the sin, right, in a way, than to just think about doing it, although as we learn in Tanya, in a way, the others worse as well, but whatever, each in their own way. Let's, I know that it's Shkia soon, because this went way longer than I thought.
In a few minutes, but we have a few minutes.
So from this we see, I'll just run through very quickly. From this we see now through these descriptions, which was really the best of my best attempt. I don't know how well it was done, but this was my best attempt. And the reason why I explained the Sefiros in this way is because using this model and thinking about it in this way, you can now make the fine gradations between the alligator and the crocodile. Right? So for example, what's the difference between Chachma, Hod, and Malchus? Because Chachma, Hod, and Malchus are all bittul. Right? Chachma is bittul because we said it's the first of the spheres, which is totally open to the external reality. Then to the truth, totally open to the truth. Then really the inner reality still, whatever. Then you have Hod, which Hod is submission, right? In action, I'm willing to let the other thing exist, right? And then you had Malchus, which is the lowest of the spheres and has no quality of itself, right? So isn't that a form of bittul? But according to this explanation, right, you see that there's a difference. Chachma is I am nothing, really, at my root. All I am is the extension of something that's beyond me, right? This is what we would call the deep bittul of Chachma, right? This is why the Alter Rebbe is going to say that Chachma is the core of that godly soul, and Chachma is emunah, Chachma is faith, right? And the reason for all this is because Chachma is my ability to be nothing except the other thing, right? Hod, which is Haidah, right, is already I am something. Hod is I exist in the same reality as this other thing. And now I'm relating to it, right? But the way that I go out to this other thing is by giving way, letting it exist, right? That's Hod, it's acknowledgement, right? Even in the way Haidah is always explained in Chassidus, is that I don't really believe in it, but fine, I'll admit that it's true. Right? I don't really see it. It's not my opinion. That's what Haidah is in the Gemara, right? Haidah in the Gemara, Haidulay, right? As it says in the Gemara, to be Meida is, it's not my opinion, but fine. That's really what Haidah is, right? So Haid is in action. It's not my reality, but fine, right? As opposed to Netzach is no, my way, right? Haid is not my reality, but fine. And Malchus, right? Malchus is the whole idea that I am something, but my something has an end. Malchus is the point where my something runs out, right? It's the end. There's nothing left, right? Which means that it's literally the point where something else is allowed to actually exist, right? It's the edge of my being, which in a way means that it's a deeper bittul than Chachma. But in another way, it's a bittul that only comes at the very end of my being, which means it's very lowly, which is why Malchus in Aveda corresponds to Kabbalah Soul, acceptance of the yoke, which is the way of saying that never mind under God being the only thing that exists. I barely acknowledge that God exists. However, since I do acknowledge that he does exist, right, I'm willing to do what he wants rather than what I want in this situation. That's Malchus, right? Which in a way, Kabbalah Soul is much higher than the deepest bittul of Chachma in its way, because it's my ability to actually not be in that place, right? It's the actual end. Its lowliness is what makes it so high. In other words, we can discuss it more on that later. There's no time, right? What about Das Sefiros Yesod and Malchus, the middle row? What's the difference between all these forms of connection?
Think about it. It's not that easy.
The truth is, we already discussed most of this. I'll just discuss the difference between Das and Tiferes, right? Which is interesting because Das is the connection making the reality that has arrived to me in my inner world real as I am, right? Whereas Tiferes is that I've already accepted that it's real from Das, right? The question is am I willing to orient myself towards it and to choose it, right, as a reality? It's that rachamim, am I willing to choose it over my preferences in terms of how I would rather be oriented and how I would rather relate to it? Am I willing to accept it just as it is because it's something else, which is what rachamim is, merciful person. Anyway, these are the sort of things, we'll stop it here. This is the sort of trying to make at least a little bit more refined, a little bit more edel, our understanding of the different koiches hanefesh, the different faculties of the soul. God willing, next week, back to reading what the Alter Rebbe has to say about all of them. The Alter Rebbe is going to go through most of the Sefiros and explain them in a very terse but very precise fashion in our chapter. So God willing, next week we continue with chapter 3 of Tanya.